Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
Okay, well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Michele Rigby Assad. Michele, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's great to be with you.
Great. So I want to give everybody a little bit of background on Michele before we get started. She is an international corporate advisor and keynote speaker, and really what she's very well known for, especially if you read her books, which I would highly encourage you do, is that she is had a 10-year career as a CIA operative in the Middle East, and now consults with several multinational companies who are facing geopolitical challenges. So she spent a lot of time with the CIA and now is leveraging that knowledge as a consultant and as an author, as you'll see in her books. And as I'd mentioned, she is the author of two terrific books. The first one is called Breaking Cover. And the second one is called Get Off the X. I would highly encourage everybody to take a read of both. They are actually both very different. The first one is very much focusing on life in the CIA and what that means. And the second book is more of a, it's almost more of a self-help book, is to say, look, if you want to get off the X, if you want to get, get your, have a challenge or get started and do things that you never thought was possible. She writes a book on how best to do this, almost taking a lot of the training and knowledge that goes into being a CIA operative and really putting that into place in your own personal life. So the books are very different in terms of the way they're the way they're read, but and the way they're structured. But I would highly recommend that people take a read of them, because again, I think you're gonna walk away with a lot of really good. First of all, if you read the first one, you get a really good understanding of life as a CIA operative, which is definitely not the same as movies and TV shows. And the second book, you'll get how to get, maybe kickstart some aspects of your life that you've been procrastinating on or whatever it may be. Again, but both of the books are terrific. So, Michele, maybe to start with, let's just go back to your childhood, because you talk a lot about in your book about how, you were kind of a normal kid growing up. Never thought you would be this, this James Bond type of CIA operative who you have turned into, frankly, whether you like it or not. But maybe just talk a little bit about your background, and did you have this, this view or this hunger in your early days for these adrenaline-seeking activities? But maybe just give us a little bit of background on your childhood.
Yeah, I think the background's important because my whole life, the theme I'm trying to spread to everyone is that if I can do it, so can you. So my beginnings were very modest, typical Middle East, middle class family in rural Central Florida. I didn't really know anything about the world. Neither did my parents. We didn't travel. They didn't even talk politics in the home. So it's not like I even had that that knowledge of things outside of my sheltered life. And but right after I graduated high school, I went on my first mission trip. So I got my first passport, traveled to Egypt as part of a group, like a missions team from my college. And we worked for a month in an orphanage,
Wow.
which was really hard work in the middle of an Egyptian summer. But that really whet my appetite to learn more about the world, to travel. It just kind of injected this wanderlust into my blood, and never having any inkling that this would eventually lead me into the CIA. Like, there's nothing further from my mind than that. As being from Central Florida, a very rural area, I didn't know people who worked for the government. I didn't even know that was a real job. But when you look back, you can see that getting into the CIA was just a series of cumulative steps that I took to learn more about the world and to put myself out there and do really different things.
Got it. Was there any appetite in your earlier days for like adrenaline-seeking activity and sort of living on the edge or the tip of the spear, or whatever the right phrase is? Is there anything like that from your childhood, Michele?
No,
Wow.
there wasn't. But there was such a hunger though to do something that was meaningful in the
Yep.
world. Like I wanted to make a difference. And my parents, though they didn't know much about the world, they trained me in this concept of wanting to win. And wanting to win wasn't wanting to be number one. It was being willing to work hard, put yourself out there, being willing to do hard things, being willing to fail and to keep getting up again until you succeed. And so I think that was really the foundation for what came next was the willingness to to challenge yourself to do things that are hard. And I kind of never turned back.
Well, I think, and again, you certainly get this out of your book. There's a lot of very, very difficult things that you and your husband have completed while CIA operatives that are extremely difficult, that you achieved very, very well. So maybe just give some perspective before you got involved with the CIA. What was your knowledge of the CIA? Like when, again, when you were growing up, because I think with many of us, obviously, that most of us have never worked in the CIA. And we get our knowledge from TVs and movies and things like that. That is for the most part, where a lot of us are gonna get our knowledge from. When you were growing up, what was your kind of understanding of the CIA? Were you like just the rest of us? Is that you kind of
Yeah.
watched it on TV? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I was just like the rest of everyone. What I knew is what I saw in a Hollywood movie. And I had this weird idea that people who did stuff like that were, multilingual
Yeah.
experts who were prepared from a young age to live this life of intrigue. Like, I just thought they were like a different kind of human being. Than certainly not like me. And so when I was getting my master's degree at Georgetown in contemporary Arab studies, which was again the cumulative effect of traveling abroad, studying in the Middle East, and all of these things I did as an undergraduate. The CIA came to recruit from Georgetown, and I sat in on that briefing and I thought, there is no way that I am the kind of person they're looking for. I'm definitely not CIA material. I don't know exactly what that is, but I know it's not me. So I was really surprised when I got a phone call from a recruiter that said, we're very interested in your resume because of all of the travel you've done in the Middle East and the fact that you're getting
Wow.
a master's degree in Arab studies. And this was like a year before 9/11. So back then, Arab studies was like, why would you do that? Like, what does that mean? What kind of a job can you get from there?
Yep.
And interestingly, that was the only job that came my direction. Like I applied to everything under the sun, and that's the only one. And I was like, seriously? Is this even real?
Yeah.
So as much as I didn't know about the CIA, and I still at that point did not, because the CIA only peels the layers of the onion as you go through the process a little bit of at a time. So you don't really know much. You're taking a huge leap of faith when you get into the CIA that you're going to enjoy it, that you're going to be good at it. I don't know. You don't know. You have
Yep.
no idea. So it is a
So,
risk.
and what type of people would they typically be interested in? Like what, like you had mentioned, obviously it was a year before 9/11. When 9/11 happens, obviously, the world kind of turns on its head, especially in North America. But is it the world traveler that someone who's worked in a lot of different, or let's say has experimented, or been around a lot of different countries when they were growing up and kind of have that worldly view? Is that kind of the one characteristic that they would look for?
Yeah, so the recruiters said what we need people who can operate in foreign cultures seamlessly. So again, that requires someone who's been there. You can't just read about it in a book. You've got to be on the mean streets of Cairo to know how to
Yeah,
interact with
absolutely.
Egyptians. So um they were like, so you have to be able to operate in a foreign culture well and easily. And you have to be able to operate under a lot of stress. So if you can't make decisions on the fly, if you get stressed out super easily, if you just have anxiety, oozing out of every pore, this is not the career for you.
Yeah.
Like you have to be able to roll with the punches, make sound operational decisions on the fly. And of course, they train you, what that looks like. But if you don't have that foundational personality of, a sense of adventure, but also responsibility, then you're not really cut out for that kind of job.
So you listen to the presentation on campus. They give you a flavor of what they're all about. It sparks your interest. You have an interest in it. Now, much of what you just described, they obviously can't tell through discussions with you on campus. Obviously, the first step then is the interview process. And I'm sure all of us are thinking in our mind, like all the things you just described in terms of ability to deal with stress and all this other sort of stuff. There'd be a lot of, I bet you, unique ways in an interview process where they could probably evaluate your ability to do that. Give us some perspective, like, maybe walk us down and say, what did you think? So you get a call one day from the recruiter saying, we'd love to interview you, Michelle. I'd love to know what you thought the interview process would be. And then when you sat in on it, what was it like? And was it, how similar was it to what you had actually expected?
Yeah. So the first few phone calls, I think, were just to make sure that you're not some crazy person on the other end of the phone call. Like, honestly, because you can imagine you get all kinds of
Oh
resumes at the
yeah. Mhm.
CIA. So, like, first one, pass, not a crazy person. They don't have, aluminum foil tin cap on their head or something like that.
Yep.
But very quickly in those interviews, they asked foreign affairs questions. Just a series of questions like, are you up on what's going on in the world? And so that also very quickly weeds out people who you have to know foreign relations if you're going to be involved in this kind of job.
Yep.
So that wasn't surprising to me. Also, the interviews were long. And so I think that's the difference between a CIA interview and like a corporate interview. So if you spend, 30, 45 minutes or even an hour with the person, if you're trying to hold something back or some aspect of your personality you don't want them to know about, you can do that. But if
Yep.
you've got a 2 or 3 hour interview with someone, you're going to slip. If you're, they're going to really
Yeah.
get to know you. And I thought that was very clever. I'm like, that's a really good way to assess a person for a job. And
And
then, of
how,
course, asking, really deep questions about who you are, what made you, what motivates you as a person, all that's very important.
so your ability to kind of deal with stress, does that sort of come later then? And your ability to deal with kind of tricky situations, is that kind of stage two once you go down, once you perhaps further into the interview process, or I guess at that point, once you get into the training, then it's, I guess, game on type of thing at that point.
Yeah, of course, they ask you to talk about situations where you've been under stress and had to make decisions. But of course, you can always fabricate that,
Yep.
and where the rubber meets the road is in training. So if you have a robust training program, you're going to discover very quickly if somebody's got the guts and can handle stress or not. And of course, just like the military, just kind of like any kind of intensive program, it's laid out to become more and more stressful as you learn and you build your skill sets. And so you get called. I mean, if you can be hired into the CIA and still not get through the training program and not be hired, right? So you have to
Yep.
go through an entire year of tradecraft training. And at any point in that year, if you can't handle the stress, if you're not reflecting the skills that they need, you're done.
Yeah. And maybe give some background and educate folks, maybe who, again, a lot of us are getting our information on the CIA, even folks in North America are getting a lot of information on the CIA from, from movies and television. You probably have a lot of people outside North America who have a very limited understanding of even what the CIA does. Maybe just give us some background on what the role of the CIA is, in the United States and where they kind of play at a global scale.
Great question. So, a lot of people just assume the CIA is a law enforcement agency. We are not. The CIA is an intelligence agency, and this is a very important distinction to make. We don't enforce laws, we collect information, foreign information, not information inside the United States. So, there's very clear laws that the CIA has to operate underneath. And so we collect intelligence in other countries that we vet, package, and send to our policymakers. So we don't enforce laws. We don't even tell the president or Congress or the military what they should do. We don't provide policy suggestions at all. Literally, intel collection, pass it on, they make the decisions. So a lot of people think we have all kinds of powers and we really don't. And thankfully it's very limited to information collection.
And when you're going through the interview process and apply, like what are the chances? Would you have envisioned that that you'd have to relocate, go into a foreign country and live in basically, like a really high risk environment,
Yeah.
in the early days. Like, is that pretty much the status quo for folks in your line of work? Is that when you go in there, they're telling you up front to say, look, like this isn't, work from home environment, where we get to, stay in our basement and sit at a computer. This is a little different. You're gonna have to pick up and relocate and completely change your lifestyle.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the entire point is that you're going to live abroad at not necessarily for your entire career, but that's, hopefully going to be a big portion of your career. So yeah, it is an international career period. Um, Now that's not to say there aren't some jobs in the CIA and some career thrusts that are very, they're based out of Northern Virginia or wherever. Because those people, there's a huge support staff that doesn't go abroad. But in the clandestine service, that's entirely the point of it, that you're going to go abroad. You're going to move every year or two. And if you think back, Scott, like pre 9/11, there was a different expectation about the kinds of places we would be sent. And then
Yep.
post
Yeah.
9/11,
Yeah.
then a whole other world opens up to us, and we're suddenly getting sent to crazy war zones and high conflict areas, very dangerous places. So, the training had to adapt to prepare us for, getting off the X, getting out of, surviving an ambush, surviving a terror attack. If the worst case ever happens, you've got the knowledge you need to try to survive. So, we were right there at the threshold of that change in government. So that meant because my husband and I came in together as Arab world specialists, of course, that's going to mean we're going to spend the majority of our career in some of the most difficult places,
Yep.
which of course made for a very interesting career, but it was very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And is there a movie or TV series that best captures? I can imagine a lot of it. For me, I'm a huge Homeland fan. I don't know if you've seen Homeland. Is there a movie or TV series that is as close to the truth, or would you say it's very difficult to pick one that would actually, be reflective of what you actually did?
If I had to choose one, I would say Homeland is
Yeah.
closest. Although, of course, if you made it look real, it'd be too boring for people to watch.
Yeah.
But, Carrie, she's the star of Homeland, right? So she has like, 5 different hats that she wears. So she's an
Yeah.
ops officer, she's a tech officer, she's a, cyber specialist, she's all these things. Um, but I think there's two major things people don't realize. When you carry out operations, you've thoroughly planned and gotten them approved. So you don't do anything you rarely do anything on the fly. Mostly we take a lot of time to plan our ops. And then the other side of that is you've got to write them up. So if you don't write it up, it never happened. That's what we say in the CIA. So
Wow.
you've got to be very good at, it's crazy, report writing. If you're going to communicate the very critical information you just collected well, you've got to be able to communicate that to the decision makers. Um, and then the other side of that is, you have to be very good at vetting information, because it's not hard to collect information. A lot of people think that, and there's certain places in the world where it's very difficult to collect intel. Take North Korea, for example. That might be the most obvious one. Very
Yep.
difficult to do that. But in places like the Middle East, it's actually not hard. What is difficult is getting good information,
Yeah.
because people don't realize the extent to which we deal with liars and fabricators and cheats and double agents and all kinds of challenges to collecting good information. So that might be the thing people don't realize is the hardest part.
Well, and you certainly, if you read your books, you certainly get an appreciation for all the things you just said, because there's a number of cases where you're able to identify folks that weren't being truthful or whatever whatever it may be. So you go through the interview, you're accepted. Now, like you say, there's a training process. Maybe just give us a little bit of insight into what the training involves. And because like you say, they're training you to do very, very difficult things under a very high degree of stress. they've got to train you up in order to be able to deal with us. Maybe give us a little bit of perspective on what the training looks like.
Well, it teaches you, and again, all of this information was cleared by the CIA, so I'm not giving away anything. I mean, every intelligence agency in the world trains like this. Um, but you have to learn how to identify a potential source, how to recruit them, how to handle them, and that word handle means how to meet clandestinely, safely with them. You have to learn the ins and outs of writing up those reports. You have to learn how to identify what's good information, what's potentially bad, how to vet that information, how to identify surveillance. Because if you go to your clandestine meeting and someone's following you to that meeting, you could blow your source.
Yep.
So there's aspects of this. If you think like you're training to be like a bank robber, like, because the word casing, is you learn how to case what you're going to use as a meeting location, and you're like, wow. I mean, the people who are best suited for this are bank robbers. They've done that before I haven't, which is fascinating. So you have to learn all these strange skill sets that, again, unless you've robbed a bank, you have no knowledge of whether you're any good at it. So, all the mechanics of meeting with your source, super fascinating, but really hard, because to carry out a successful operation requires you to consider about 1,000 different things.
Yeah. And when you get in there, I could just imagine, when you meet the people you're training with, I could just imagine before you got there, if it was me, I'd probably be thinking like, these must be like, the smartest people on the planet, aced everything, going to the gym 7 days a week, like the picture perfect of hell. Um, but again, your background is again, rural Florida, grew up in a normal household, world traveler. Um, but maybe just give it like, what is close to the truth? Were the people more like you were in terms of a more, let's call it a more normal upbringing, a more middle
Yeah.
class upbringing, or were they just like, again, these superstars who just were like the top of their class in every university across the US?
They're like me. That would
That's
probably
surprising,
Yeah. It is surprising, and, but when I say like me, regular people from middle class backgrounds who didn't have families that were working for the government, most of the people I worked with, this was, like, so far out of the range of their normal as well, which is interesting. But I would say that we all had this drive and grit, and that's really important. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm gonna do the very best I can at this, and then I'm just gonna keep going, and I'm not gonna give up, and I'm gonna learn. Like, so that hunger to achieve is a really important part of this. They don't want to hire people who think mediocrity is, that's the standard. No, you want people who are gonna push, and push hard. So while I have a very simple background, I've always been the kind of person that expects to work hard, expects to go the distance, expects to, um, to, do things that people don't expect.
Yeah.
And I think that is important to point out, and I'll tell you why, because I think this younger generations are being fed a diet of, if it hurts or it's difficult, you should quit. And I think that's very dangerous, because I've lived my life doing the opposite. And in my opinion, that is the only way to live a meaningful and purposeful life, is to be willing to go out on the edge. You can't be the person that's like, well, that's not in my resume, or,
Yeah.
that wasn't in my job description. I was like, you know what? That living like that, you're going to live in the borders of a very small box.
And look, I think when you look at your two books together, I think that's exactly what the message is that you said it earlier, is that if you can do it, anybody can do it. And I'm oversimplifying that message because it's really, I don't think that's 100% true, but clearly if you have skill sets that are not, you don't have to be the smartest person in the world. A lot of this just comes down to work ethic and attitude. And a lot of that's, some of that stuff you can train. Like, again, in your second book, you talk a lot about, how to get things started and how to get off the X, but human beings all have those traits. And, if you can build the attitude and build the work ethic, you can achieve a lot. You know what I mean? As you have,
100%.
right? Like, it's almost like if you compare those people that you're with, and really what perhaps what the CIA is looking to identify is, like you say, the people who, when it comes to work ethic and attitude, when pushed, they're off the scale. Again, it doesn't really
Yes.
matter about their background per se, but if they have those two items, they can train the rest of it. You know what I mean? They can train you to do the rest of it, because at some point those other two things will just take over.
It's so true. And, I have a lot of friends who run businesses, and they're telling me how difficult it is with these younger generations that say, wait a minute, you're expecting me to work harder than someone else. Like, I have achieved so much in life because I did work harder than other people, because I did go the extra mile, because
100%.
I went outside of my my job description. And that that's how I became a professional speaker. That's why I'm a sought after speaker. That's why. That's
100%.
why I was good in the CIA. Again, like you said, I am rarely the smartest person in the room, but I'm probably the hardest working in the room.
Well,
So
just look at your
that does
books,
make a
right?
difference.
Well,
Yeah.
just look at your books. You were not an author until you wrote the book, right? Like you must have just come to like, look, I can do this, right? Like it's not like you have a background, even in university or anything, about writing books. This is just something that said, look, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to learn.
Yes.
I'm going to put in the work, and look what the product is. The finished product is now two books that are excellent, right? Like again, it's another really good example of just like you say, you're taking it. You know what I mean? You're not just
Yeah.
waiting back, right? So.
Right. Oh yeah, things do not just fall in your lap. I mean, I have seen every now and then some person that life seems very easy for them. But for the majority of us, you have to work for those opportunities to show up.
100%.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, the other thing that's unique with you is, you worked alongside your husband. So you and your husband has obviously talked a lot about it in the book as well. And that's obviously, I'm guessing in the CIA that is somewhat unique, where you have a
Yeah.
spouse who's right alongside you. Give us a little bit of perspective on, maybe the pros and the cons of kind of working right beside your husband.
Yeah, and I say this not knowing whether they still do this in the CIA. They were starting to turn against this, and I can't come up with any good reason why, because it always worked so very well. Um, when you are in extremely stressful situations, and for us, we were working literally on the edge of the earth, a place that would take 36 hours of travel to reach.
Wow.
Um, you're in the hinterlands. This was before, the internet and the connectivity and the digital book and the WhatsApp phone calls and the ability to pick up your phone and call anywhere in the world. This was during a time when we didn't have that. So, um, if I was not next to my spouse and we were not going through this experience together, I couldn't have done it personally. I don't have it. So I needed to be alongside someone that I trusted. And so we would look after each other. We would support each other. We were working towards the same things. And so it was kind of, and we had nothing else. We just had each other.
Yep.
And so that made that crazy 10-year career doable. Now, the difficult side is after 10 years of that, it was weighing on our marriage. I mean, this the stress of that, the all those years being away from family and friends, being
Oh yeah.
in other countries, like living undercover, uh, just living in really dangerous environments where we're always having to look to see whether we're being surveilled, hostile surveillance, not just during operations, just like everyday life to be sure we weren't being targeted. It's hard, and at the end of that 10-year career, we were like, okay, this is this is weighing on our relationship. Like this might be the end of that, yeah, the road for that career, which, think it was, thankfully.
So so you get through all the training. And now you're finally, part quote unquote officially part of the CIA. Now the next thing is that they say, hey Michelle, hey Joseph, you're now going to country redacted, because in your book you're not even allowed to say what that country is. So to give people some perspective on what we're going to talk about in a second here about the dangers, the country's not even mentioned in the book. It's country blacked out or country redacted. So so I guess the first question, Michelle, is do you have any choice when they sit there and say you and your husband are going here? Do you have any choice at all? Or is it like, you know what? The message received, we're, getting our plane tickets and off we go.
Sometimes you have choice. A lot of times you do have choice. A lot of times in the shadow of 9/11, we didn't have choices. So it was a mix. So there were several assignments that we did choose. The first one we chose knowing it was going to be really difficult and dangerous. Um, I don't quite know how we survived that tour. Then we went to a better location, a much less dangerous place. But then we got surged to Baghdad for a year. That's the one place we're allowed to mention. And that was not by choice. Um, and so there was a lot of groaning and complaining about that surge. We didn't want to go. That sounded like the worst place possible to serve in CIA, like literally the worst place. But what I find very fascinating about that is that that turned out to be the place where I really developed my skills and tradecraft as an intelligence officer. So the very place that I thought was like like a curse to be sent there turned out to be the best development of my career. Isn't that fascinating?
That is that no, that is, and again, you talk a lot of, in your book, about fate, about things happen for a reason, right? And
Yeah.
we didn't, you even talk about your path with the CIA. There was kind of multiple paths to go down there. One didn't work out, and then another one opened up. And
Yes.
to some degree, fate plays a role. And
I'm a big
and
believer in that. Yeah.
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 So
And then sometimes the things that feel really bad in the moment, like a rejection or a closed door or a path that's just not coming through, there's a reason for that. And so you certainly don't know that when you're going through it. It's just super painful and it knocks you down and it knocks you out and it's really hard. But when you have enough life experience, then you can look back and you're like, oh my gosh, if I had walked through that door, I wouldn't be doing this amazing thing over here. And so at the end of the day, I now know to have perseverance through what feels bad or difficult or shocking because if I'm if I'm committing my life to doing something really purposeful, then the right doors will open at the right time. Like
yep.
if I'm committing to doing good in the world, and I know that sounds really cheesy, but that's just the person that I am. I really think that um, to do to not live a life full of anxiety, you have to be focused on others, and you
Yep.
have to be focused on missions that are serving other people's interests.
No, I think that's great advice. Yeah, I agree. Now, maybe give some perspective. You talked about earlier about how, the life of a CIA operative in some of these countries will be really boring compared to what maybe we see on Homeland, where Carrie is running all over the place. But maybe you do a very good job in your book of really describing the day-to-day life as a CIA operative. It's not what you see in the movies and television. It's dangerous. There's risks of kidnappings and things like that, which is super scary. You've got to be on your toes 24/7, but maybe give us some perspective on life in these danger zones. Like
Yeah.
what is a day in the life of a CIA operative in country redacted?
Yeah. So, the closest thing to a Hollywood movie would be that year in Baghdad. So it was the worst part of the war. We were surged there in 2006, and this is when ethnic cleansing and terrorism and radical Shia attacks were at fever pitch across the entire state of Iraq. And what the day in the life of a CIA operative was waking up to a car bomb. So you wake up, everything is shaking. You just think to yourself, okay, dozens of people just died. It's a terrible like good morning.
Yeah.
All these innocent Iraqis just died. Then you get ready, you go into the office, and then you spend the next 10 hours like jumping through so many hoops. I'm telling you that the amount of critical information we were bringing in, the location of the car bomb, the place where they just dug the IED in the street, the location of the terror safe houses, the names and identifying data of the cell members. These things were coming in like a fire hose, Scott, every hour of every day. And you'd get threat related information. You'd get that information. You'd go running up the stairs so that you could call into the military unit before you put it into a report. Like,
Yeah.
no time to put it into a report. You got to call the military commander for that area and said, please stop. Your guys are about to roll over an IED. Or please go to this following location and you should find a VBIED that's almost constructed. And so we were, I am not kidding, hair on fire, running up and down those steps with threat reports, passing them
Wow.
to the military so they can action them. So it was really physically exhausting. Um, then in the afternoon, for whatever reason, it's the funniest thing, but every afternoon between about 3 and 5 o'clock, the Shia militants would shoot rockets into the green zone at us. And so
Wow.
this is the time when we would generally take a break and go work out. So we were generally like out and about during that 2 hours, working out, taking a shower, getting food so we could go back to our desk and work till midnight. And we would be running to bunkers because the alarm would go off telling us a rocket was mid-flight and it's heading in your directions. You're just running to bunkers, um, working till midnight, falling into bed completely exhausted, hearing shelling all night long while you're trying to sleep. Someone's getting shelled somewhere, and then waking back up again like Groundhog Day and doing it all over again.
Wow.
It was super exhausting, but yet what made it worth it is that we were saving lives. And it was very clear, when the military is like, yeah, we found the car bomb, and
Yeah.
it was all, almost fully constructed. And you're thinking, well, we just saved dozens or hundreds of lives, thank God. So that kind of fed the motivation to keep going when it was such a difficult job and it was such heavy, and seeing pictures of tortured bodies and dead terrorists, and that's heavy stuff
Yeah.
to deal with
Yeah.
emotionally and mentally and spiritually and all of that. So, but it was worth it, right? So you only do for a year. That's about all you can take. But it was such an interesting year.
Yeah, that is, like, you almost can't even picture something like that, in terms of, if you're outside, working in a business environment like myself, you almost just can't even picture, something like that. You can't even put yourself in that environment. Now, you had a chapter in your first book called, Getting Off the X, which then ultimately led to the title of your second book. Now, we had one of our previous guests on. We had a guy by the name of Jay Dobbins who was an undercover agent for the ATF, and he worked undercover for the Hells Angels, or worked undercover with the Hells Angels, and he talks a lot about staying on the X as long as he possibly can, because he'd be staying in that danger zone. Is that he'd be putting himself in the Hells Angels clubhouse, and the goal would be to stay on that X as long as possible. And he would say that's completely different than, a lot of these special forces and other folks who are focusing on getting off the X, which is obviously what you're focused on as well. And that chapter has nothing to do with, it really is not applicable. The chapter itself was not applicable for folks in the business world, at least at the time. So maybe just take us a little bit through that particular story and that particular chapter, and maybe just talk a little bit about how that seemed to be a very popular chapter amongst your readers and how that sort of
Okay.
transitioned into your second book.
Yeah. So right before we finished our tradecraft training, the CI put us through a crash and bang course, and this get off the X training. We had to qualify in Glock and an M4. So we had to do all of this paramilitary training. And so this get off the X training was counter ambush training. How do you survive if you're ambushed by a terrorist or criminal or whoever? And so the idea is that when you're under massive stress, you're under attack, you either fight, flight, or freeze. Those are the responses. And when you have this adrenaline surging through your body and the fear hormones that you're dumping everywhere, and you're just trying to figure out what the heck's going on, a lot of time people freeze. And so in this training, they were trying to condition us not to freeze. Like whatever you do, you have to get off the X or the site of the attack and move. So if your car is operable, your car is the safest place to be. And you can crash through all kinds of things in order to get away if you need to. You can use your car as a weapon to get away. But if you are, engine's been blown out, then you gotta get out of your car and run, which is terrifying, but that's what you gotta do. So after taking this training multiple times and actually having to use the training in the field to save my life more than a couple of times, um, I realized like, wow, this is such a powerful concept. The idea of not freezing, pushing yourself through fear, pushing yourself through uncertainty. And this is directly applicable as a metaphor for life. Like, how do you not get stuck in life? And how easy it is for us to just sit on this X, like sit in the comfort zone. This is what I've always done. This is what's easy to do. And you stop challenging yourself. You stop trying new things. You stop, as a company, innovating. And I was like, why don't we think of this get off the X as a way, a strategy for how we live our lives? And so what it was really interesting after Breaking Cover came out, I would talk about this in my corporate speaking events, and people would parrot it back to me years later. And I thought, man, that resonates with people.
It
They'd
does.
say, like,
Absolutely.
Michelle, we're still getting off the X. I'm like, you are? How do you even remember that? Uh, and I got so many messages from people saying, you've really helped change my life because I'm challenging myself to get off the X. Well, but then they would say, I'm inspired to do something different, but how do I make that happen? Like, how do I actually operationalize the desire to get unstuck? So I knew there was a second book almost as soon as Breaking Cover came out. And so that that is the second book, which is literally you want to get unstuck in your company or your professional life or your personal life. Um, but it gives you actual methodologies and tools to do that.
It's interesting that people would read that chapter and get to that point, because I would encourage people to go and buy the book and actually read that chapter, because that chapter is like a funky chapter. You could try and predict what's in that chapter right now, and I can tell you right now, you are not going to be able to predict the story that Michelle shares in that particular chapter. That is a true story. Um,
It
so
wasn't fun in the moment, but it's fun to talk about it now, you
I could
know?
imagine. I could imagine. Yeah, that is true. So, you know, y- what are some of the warning signs then that we're on the X? And we're not talking about CIA agent on the X. We're talking about lifestyle on the X. What are some of the warning signs that we're kind of stuck on the X, or stuck in a spot?
Loss of motivation. You have those moments you're like, why do I get up every day? What am I doing with my life? Um, Sickness. A lot of times, our bodies tell us something's wrong before we realize something's wrong. So you get sick all the time. That's an indicator. Um, you just feel uh, anxiety. So I think one of the telltale signs that we're not moving forward and we're stuck is this just overwhelming sense of generalized anxiety. So those are really good indicators. If you're honest with yourself, you realize something's wrong. Something has to change.
And what would you say is, the hardest part of getting off the X? Because I could imagine in a lot of those scenarios, those are difficult obstacles to overcome. It's not just you can
Yeah.
just wake up one morning, flip a switch, and off you go to the races. It's not quite that simple. Um,
Right.
what's from your perspective, what's kind of the hardest part in getting off the X?
Getting started.
Yeah.
The hardest part is breaking the inertia that holds us back. That mounting the energy to take the first step off that X is the hardest part. So I'll take a real life example because we all know this. Getting into the gym to work out. Sometimes you feel like, my God, I do not want to get into my workout clothes and go to the gym. Like, it's so hard. And then you get there and you're like, this is fine. Why was I making this such a big deal? Like, once you're in the gym, you say, just, walk on the treadmill for half a mile. And you walk on the treadmill, next thing you know, you're running on the treadmill.
Yep.
So I always say the hardest part is getting started.
And how do we get started? Is there a trick to just kind of getting started?
Yes. So I always say, first of all, you have to know what's holding your back. Like, what's gotten you stuck? You have to diagnose it like a doctor. Is it fear? Is it uncertainty? Is it intimidation? Or is it an actual circumstance? because sometimes they're legitimate. Sometimes they're in our heads, and sometimes it's like global COVID, the death of a loved one, you just retired, you just graduated university. There's all these things that are circumstances that throw us into this like zone of uncertainty. So
Yep.
you diagnose it, but the first thing is to say, every single day, what can I do today to get off the X? And I think we get tripped up on wanting to do the next perfect thing, the next best thing. We need the perfect plan. We need the proven plan. We need the cut through. We need the hack. I'm telling you, actually opposite. Get off the X. I say it's the opposite. The one little thing you can do each day is it creates energy. For whatever reason, energy begets energy and possibility begets possibility. So what it's saying is do anything, even if imperfect, because that's enough to get you moving in the right direction, which is
Got it.
counterintuitive.
Now, you mentioned a couple of things there, in terms of getting off the X, but one of the things you talked about was or mentioned was intimidation. So, what is intimidation, and how does this relate to getting off the X?
I'll take my own life as an example. I'm like the queen of being intimidated by new things. Like, this is who I am. I don't know whether I have the requisite skills or knowledge or intellect, to be in the CIA, to be an intelligence officer, to go live in the Middle East, to write a book. And it turns out that that's all just wasted anxiety because not only could I do all of those things, it turns out I can do them really well.
Absolutely.
So intimidation is that little voice inside your head that says, "Nah, I don't know if you can do that. I don't know if you have what it takes." And so you have to basically get really good at doing it anyway.
So how did you get over it? Like you say, you grew up in, middle class rural Florida. Like you could say, you weren't like this. You didn't come from this family of like, secret agent after secret agent, and you were trained from, 3 years old. I'm sure even that first day when you started training at the CIA and walked in there and looked around and saw all your colleagues there. I could imagine again, if it was me, I'd be super intimidated, right?
Hmm.
How
Oh, yeah.
how do you get over that? Like, how did you was there a trick to kinda just getting through it? You just plow through it and just say, "Look, I just need to tell that voice in my head to, take a
Yep.
back seat?"
Yes. That's it. I just was like, that I am intimidated. Holy cow. I just walked across the CIA SEAL walking into the CIA. Like, what the heck? What am I doing here? And when are they going to figure out they've hired the wrong person? That imposter syndrome rears its ugly head. And I just kept going. So I think the best way through imposter syndrome or intimidation is just to keep going. Like, you keep going until the road stops. So if you get thrown out of the program, then you'll know you didn't have the skills, the necessary skills. And then there's something better for you. There's something different and better. So it's nothing crazy. The strategy is literally just to keep moving through it.
Did you tell a great story in your book about when you took the car driving training? And again, I can imagine that you're sitting there thinking, "Man, like, these other people, they must be like race car drivers and stuff like that, right?" Or they grew up on, like, movie sets where this is all they do, and then here you are have to all of a sudden go through and do this obstacle course and, but
Yeah.
how did you get through that?
So yeah, on the last day of our crash and bang course, we were exhausted, so we've been driving hard, doing all this crazy stuff all week long. It's like Friday afternoon, end of the day, you're just totally spent. And we got to drive through this crazy obstacle course. We get to the end, then we have to reverse it through the obstacle course. Um, and I'm thinking, my God, I have all these people in my class with me. They're former cops. So they've been through all kinds of car training. This is just like a little ounce of what they got in their entire careers. Like, what the heck? These guys are so good at this. And uh, I don't even know what I'm doing. So I waited till I was like, I'm going to go last. So uninspired to do this. I was like, I'm embarrassed to even do it. So I went last. And it turns out that I outdrove all my other classmates and I won this little exercise. And I thought, geez, Michelle, do you not ever learn to stop being intimidated by things? Like, this is ridiculous. So at some point, you start realizing, okay, you start overcoming that voice in your head. You're like, no, I can do this, which is so valuable, which you don't know until you drive the obstacle course. Like you push yourself forward. I'm actually a pretty aggressive driver in life. I'm pretty, I've got a little bit of a lead foot, and it turns out like I'm good at obstacle courses. I'm a good driver. Um, so yeah, I just decided, like I made the decision. I'm never going to hold myself back. Like that's it. I'm done with that.
Oh, it's a great story. It's a great example. The other thing the other thing you learn by reading your books and what you've been exposed to is that you have a really good understanding of people and your
Mm.
ability to read people. And maybe just talk a little bit about cognitive bias. What is cognitive bias and how does that play in? Because I think that's also an important thing about how people portray how confident they are and what that actually means. So give us some perspective on, yeah, again, you have a bunch of really good stories in your book about, people portraying themselves as one thing. And then when you dig in, you actually find out that none of it or very little of it is actually true. And therefore, again, you might have been intimidated by something, but it's actually false. It's not actually
Facade.
true. Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
you got their story in their particular about a guy who's bragging about his motorcycle and it just happens to be down the street from where you actually lived in Florida, which that again, you pick up her book, take a read of that story. It's a great story. But maybe just give us some background on cognitive bias and how that plays into things.
Yeah, so I think we have this cognitive bias that tells us that if somebody is confident, they know what they're doing, or they're really smart, or So we relate confidence with ability, and after decades in this interesting work environment of the CIA and Capitol Hill in Washington D.C., I can tell you firsthand that almost like the more confident people are, the more they actually don't know, or it's a facade, and maybe they're an inch deep actually on most topics. So I realized that narcissists are very confident people, and they can talk a good game, and so can fabricators and liars and a lot of the double agents. They're very smart. They can talk a good game. They can impress the socks off of people who don't know the topic. But then when you actually learn a topic well and you become very deep in that area, as I did serving all of those years in war zones and conflict areas and um, difficult places, I would then interact with members of Congress and their staff. I would interact with other members of the military and the CIA, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I spent all this time thinking these were the smartest people in the world, and it turns out they really don't know what they're talking about." Um, so you have to say to yourself, "I may not feel confident, but I need to act confident until I learn my um, my tradecraft, until I learn my job, until I develop my career, develop myself in my career. Then the confidence comes later. Um, but at the end of the day, I always think that humility is really important. So understanding the limits of your own knowledge is wisdom. And I always am very skeptical if I see someone who's too full of confidence. I think, okay, what are they hiding? What's really going on there?
Well, the other thing to talk a little bit about is your knowledge of people. The people you were dealing with, obviously, for all of us in the business environment, we generally speaking are not going to be dealing with those people. However, I would think that some of the learnings that to some degree people are people. And there are some similarities, perhaps in those experiences, but maybe just talk a little bit about your ability to read people, how that was developed in the CIA, and then how you apply that not only in the business world, because you have your consulting company that you work at with your husband, but also in your personal life as well. You have lots of interrelationship dealings, but how was that built out in the CIA? And then how do you apply that today when you're outside of the CIA?
Yeah, so I didn't realize I had that ability to read people or understand people or have a real good sense where people were coming from. Um, but I realized in the CIA that it was more like espionage and dealing with spies and being in the spy world was more a game of the mind, and it was a game of understanding the other person really well. Um, you because fundamentally, if it doesn't matter if you're in the CIA or if you're in the business world, if you can't understand uh, your client, if you don't understand the people buying your products, if you don't understand your investors, if you have not worked out what motivates them, where they're coming from, what they need, then you're not going to hit those pain points.
Yep.
So I realized in the CIA, as I interacted with terrorists and insurgents who are very interesting people because they're very street smart. So they have a very high level of EI, emotional intelligence. Well, in dealing with them, I realized that I had a high level of emotional intelligence. So it was such an interesting, like, game of wits
Mhm.
dealing with these guys. I love it so much. This challenge of like, this dude across the table from me is reading me and he's reading my body language and I'm reading him and like, who's going to win this game? Like, so interesting. And so the process of saying, okay, how do I get this guy who thinks I'm an idiot because I'm a female and that I should never leave the home, never mind think I could work in the CIA. I should never be dealing with dangerous, issues like terrorism. Like I am out of my realm. I should be bearing babies and raising a family. That's it. That's my purpose in life. That's what they think. So you can't be intelligent. You can't know anything about the Middle East if you're from the United States. And I had to just use my EI to work these guys and show them that I'm opposite of what they think I am. And so that little game of establishing my bona fides with them, establishing my authority, and then getting them to flip and and say like, wait a minute, okay, she's not what I thought she was. She's really smart because that's what I needed to show them. I'm not one of those people that's like, look how smart I am. But with these guys, you have to like, you have to come out swinging because they're so aggressive. And so you kind of have to be aggressive back in a certain kind of way. And when you hit all those things with them, then they turn the corner like, you're cool. I want to work with you. And it's like this huge score. And I realized in those interactions that I had this really keen ability to read body language, to read people, and then figure out how to interact with them in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah. And how
So
do
I
you
might
apply
have a
that today?
source. Yeah. So I might have a source that's a mid-level insurgent that like breaks people's legs when they don't fall into line, is very different than the source who has a PhD and is working in a university. Those are two very different guys. You're
Absolutely.
not going to talk to them in the same way. If you do, you're not going to get anywhere. And unfortunately, a lot of my colleagues were falling into this, like, it's just another source and you deal with all sources in the same way. Oh, heck no. So in every day, what you were just asking me, how does this every day, we are all dealing with people who come from every kind of background, every kind of education level. You know, if you deal with everyone in a cookie cutter manner, you're just not going to get very far.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the more that you can um, alter the way you do business with people based on who they are and what they're bringing to the equation, the more you're going to be able to hit on the right areas and be more successful in your job pitch, in your product pitch, in your investment pitch, whatever that is. Like um, people are different. And when we start dealing with them as they're all the same, we lose.
Yeah. So if we go back to getting off the X, let's assume you have somebody who's listening and says, Michelle, like, look, I love everything you say. However, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm showing all those warning signs. I'm not motivated. I have trouble getting up in the morning. But you know what? Like, I don't know what I want to do in this world. What would be your advice to them?
So get off the X is a process. Like you said earlier, Scott, you said it's not one and done. That's 100% correct. Because I think the hardest question in life, what am I supposed to do with my life? That is it. That's like the golden question everyone wants to know. What am I supposed to be doing? So get off the X says, here are different strategies you can take, right? To figure out what is the next step for you. Basically, it's exploring your world. It's getting yourself out there. It's doing the opposite of isolating. sitting in a corner and doing nothing.
Yep.
It's pushing yourself out there in the world to experience life, to meet people. What I've noticed in my own life, the more I got out there, the more I asked questions, the more I tried different things, my hand at different things, the more I realized, well, I suck at that. That's probably not my life's calling. Or I'm no good at this other thing. Okay, we'll strike that off the list. It gets you closer to the place that you are supposed to be. So the strategy is that it's never one and done. It is a process. It's a very long process for some of us. I mean, for me, my God, it took me years to figure that out. So you can never give up. You have to keep, no matter how painful it is, putting yourself out there and trying different things. And then, the book even gives you another strategy, which is why not shoot for the stars? So not only are you doing these little everyday inertia breakers, you're just doing the next thing to get off the X. Then every now and then it's like, why not apply to the CIA? Why not apply to your dream job? Why not, even if you have no idea what it takes? And you'll be surprised every now and then those things will work. Those power moves, I call them power moves. Those power moves will
Yep.
produce. And what if they don't? So what? Then you tried and it didn't work.
The other thing from your book that I could imagine was a huge decision is leaving the CIA. I think I didn't really appreciate when, the challenges of leaving, because you leave and then most of us in a regular situation would have a resume that we could say, "Hey, this is all the stuff we've done." You leave the CIA, you're not really allowed to speak about anything that you've done. Yeah, you've got a resume, but the whole thing's blacked out. Is that you can't actually speak about it. So what it sounds like a lot of folks do is they just tend to stay in the CIA. Maybe they
Yeah.
take a desk job or whatever it may be. But just talk a little bit, because that must have been a huge decision for you and Joseph to decide to actually leave, and a huge leap. And you don't actually appreciate that until you read your book, and it actually makes sense. Like when you go through and walk through it all in your book, it would be a huge decision and a huge risk to actually choose to leave the CIA.
Yeah, it was a huge risk. It was very intimidating. I think the closest thing I kind of compare it to is like if you get out of prison and you've been in prison for a
Yeah.
while.
Yep.
I know that sounds very strange, but you've been in this prison world. You've been isolated from the rest of the world. Well, it's very similar in the CIA, especially like our particular careers in war zones and kind of on the edge of the earth type places. We were in the CIA bubble for 10 years. You get out, or you're thinking about getting out, you have no useful resume because most of the time we don't drop cover. Like I got special dispensation to drop cover and write these books. Most of the time you don't. So you have this really vanilla resume for your cover job that doesn't say anything interesting.
Yep.
You have no idea what you're worth. You have no connections to the outside world. Like that's how most people get jobs. It's your connections, it's your network, right? Where
Yep.
we have no network. Maybe it's different these days because we have connectivity, we have the digital world. Well, back when for us, we didn't have the benefit of all of that. Um, so you have no resume, you can't say what you've done. You don't know what can I do on the outside?
Yep.
What would anyone pay me to do? Because I don't, we're not good at marketing. Like we're not good self-marketers and we're not good at self-promotion. So that's really hard for us. We don't even, how would I even market myself? What would I say? So you just have this like blank canvas. And so for those of us who are able to get out of the CIA, it's because we knew someone on the outside who appreciated where we came from and didn't need to ask those questions and could help us transition.
Yep.
But there's a lot of miserable people stuck in the CIA who don't have those connections and can't get out. Not that they're not allowed to. You can leave the CIA anytime, but good luck. It's really hard.
It's so crazy to think about that, because you think about, again, the training and the process and the people. These are incredible high performing people that are ultimately brought into the CIA family. And they would be able to do so many incredible things on the outside of the agency, right? But that's why I found it really interesting in your book to talk about the challenges of leaving. Is you have all these high performance people who can do anything, and yet it's really difficult to actually get a job once you leave, right? Because
It
if you
is.
put in your resume and it's blacked out with, this person was, sat at a desk or whatever you're allowed to say, versus somebody else who ticks every single box.
Yeah.
It's hard to compete against that, right?
You can't compete. And then there's also this, like, so you've done something that matters so much
Yeah.
for,
Yeah.
like, for us for 10 years. So you've known world events before they before they happen in the press, before anyone else knows they've happened. You're collecting the intelligence that's at the forefront of policymakers making decisions. You are doing something that matters in a war zone almost every hour of the day. So then you kind of get addicted to this lifestyle of meaning and purpose, which is a good thing to be addicted to, right? Like, you're gonna be addicted to something. And then you've got adrenaline junkies. I mean,
Yeah.
I definitely became an adrenaline junkie. Um, what do you do after that that's going to give you the same level of purpose or meaning? How do you find that on the outside? So there's
Yeah.
this fear that my life will never matter again. Yeah, that's terrifying.
Yeah, we had a Navy SEAL on one time who had described it as trying to jump off a moving freight train. It's not that easy. It's a pretty good analogy in terms of, like, again, another one. There's someone else that described it as going 100 miles an hour in your car and jamming on the parking brake. That's what it's
That's
like
so
trying to get
good.
out, right? It's not that easy to transition. So, and
Yeah.
then when you add in all the challenges you're having in terms of actually administratively trying to get out, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's part of your book that I never appreciated. I certainly didn't appreciate the difficulty of getting out. Now,
Yeah.
the other thing that you touch on in your book is you have all these great stories of people, like these incredible, and I'm not talking about people necessarily in the CIA. I'm talking about other people out there who have dealt with extreme challenges in their life, and how they've overcome these super super duper challenges. But the one that really stuck out was Glenn Coleman. One of the, and you actually wrote about him in the acknowledgement section of the book. You had an extensive piece on him. Maybe just tell a little bit about the story about Glenn, because it's when you talk about dealing with challenges and adversity, probably no better example than Glenn
Ugh.
Coleman.
Uh, so people probably want to know, why did I include these stories in my book of people who weren't in the CIA? Because it shows how regular people can use this methodology to get unstuck. Like, because I want to know, I learn from other people's lives. And so I give a couple of examples from my life and Joseph and the CIA, but I give these amazing stories of these people who are so inspirational. So Glenn was a businessman who was negotiating a contract in Kuwait. Yeah, he's an American citizen. And he happened to be in Kuwait during the invasion when Saddam Hussein's um, rolled overnight into the country and took over Kuwait literally in a matter of hours. Glenn was just, you believe it or not, was supposed to be flying home that afternoon. They were going to sign the final papers and he was going to be off to the United States. Instead, Glenn found himself taken hostage by Iraqi troops, placed on a bus with about 100 other unfortunate international hostages from the UK, from Australia, from Japan, from all these foreign countries that have nothing to do with Kuwait or Iraq or the Middle East. They were taken hostage and they were driven over the border back into Iraq and held as human shields. And if you were around during that time, and this will be for the people maybe who weren't around during that time, in the buildup to the first Gulf War, we all thought for sure that Saddam was going to kill these people. And they believed, because they didn't even know what was happening. They had no contact with the outside world. All they know is we're hostages of a dictator in a place that's possibly about to be bombed by international forces. We are going to die. And the really powerful thing about Glenn, why I had to include his story in this book, was Glenn said, I had no control over anything. I woke up every morning wondering if it would be my last. But I realized that we always have agency over our minds. No matter what, the Iraqis or Saddam Hussein could not control what I did with my mind. And he knew that even in the worst circumstances, in order to survive, you had to keep your brain healthy. And you had to keep your brain moving forward or getting off the X, even if you could do so in no other way. And so, fighting for your sanity. I mean, Glenn created games for the other hostages. Instead of Monopoly, he created a game called Monotony, which I think fully described their experience as hostages in this, desert land. Um, he drew pictures. He was an artist. If he has like a sketchbook full of like his Iraqi minders and the guard force and other hostages, and he created games. They came up with plans like if international forces are able to break, come in, this is what we'll do. So they had these, all these ideas of how they would break free and get away. Um, they negotiated with their guard force for, when things got cold, warmer blankets and warmer clothes. So anyway, he was always thinking, how can I move my brain forward if I have control over nothing else? And it was interesting. He said the hostages, which did not get off the X in their own brains, got sick and were a total mess.
Yeah.
And those that worked hard to not freeze in their minds survived the best, had the best outcomes. And amazingly, Glenn, he was at nuclear sites. He was at all of these really crazy infrastructure sites in Iraq. He had 5 different kinds of cancer. That man battled cancer for almost the rest of his life and lived to like the age of, I think it was 85 or 86.
Wow.
So it just shows how it's all here. Like the main difference is in your mind and what you do with your head and those thoughts.
And so he survives, he was there for an extended period of time that, when he came back home, did he just go back to work at his regular job? Like, how did it change his life when he actually landed back in the United States?
I think that's the other thing that's so hard is the transition back. I mean, he said it was a very difficult transition for all
Yeah.
of the hostages. You've been through, when you look back, and here's a good point. When you look back and you say, well, man, Glenn, it was only 4 months. The problem is not that it was 4 months. The problem is that they didn't know it would be 4 months.
Yeah.
So you go through these tragedies in your life. Maybe you do get cancer like Glenn. You don't know what the end point's going to be. Am I going to be around for a long time? Am I going to lose my life? You don't know when the difficulty is going to end. If we knew, okay, this tragedy is going to last for 3 years, you are going to struggle for 3 years, but you think, okay, there's an end to it. So I think the hardest part is when you don't know how long the suffering is going to go on for.
Yep.
And that's the hardest part, to keep yourself going in that uncertainty. That is the challenge. And so this book is trying to inspire people. If you're in that place, you can survive. You can survive it. You will survive it. But you've got to work. Oh my gosh, you have to work so hard to survive.
Well, yeah. And you look at, some of the examples in your book say, well, hey, look at their situations, but a million times worse than anything I've ever had to deal with. If they can deal with it, the other one that really stuck out was the girl who, got hit by the drunk driver, and she was
Lisa.
like, her family basically thought she was dead, and that was the end. Right. And, baby steps back to normal, not back fully, but I know, she doesn't remember anything before the accident, but still, they were declaring her last rites. Like it was over. Right. And,
Yeah.
like if somebody can deal with that, if
I
we're
mean, if
just
you
trying,
can deal with being hit by a drunk driver, you never asked for that. You never asked to die and come back to life. I mean, which appears to be what might have happened in that situation. She had profound amnesia. And to explain to people what profound amnesia, it's the worst kind of amnesia. It's when the doctors asked her if she remembers who the president was, she said, "What's a president?" So she
yeah,
even lost all knowledge of not just her own life and memories, but what things are. So she had her entire life stolen by a drunk driver. And if anybody has a reason to be angry or upset, it's
absolutely.
Lisa.
Absolutely.
But like Glenn, she just decided, like, I am not going to let this define who I am the rest of my life. And she built her life back up from scratch. I mean,
It's
it was
amazing.
really hard. Until this day, she has profound physical implications of, I mean, most people's like bodies do not go through this and live. Like most people, they just don't live through these things, but she's still alive and she's strong and she's such an encourager of other people. And I think, wow, if Lisa can do that, like, what
Absolutely.
am I complaining about?
Absolutely. I totally, and there's a bunch of the stories in the book. Like again, you should, the stories are a great supplement in proving out a lot of the, like you say, a lot of the approaches on how to get off the X. The stories that really supplement and show how those can be used in action. They're terrific stories. Um,
Thank you.
so as we wrap up, Michelle, what's next on the list? Is there another book in the work? Do you find yourself on the X now that you finished your
Oh,
book in
yeah.
terms of like saying, what's next? Because I can imagine it was a huge challenge to get the book out the door, and now you finish, and obviously you're happy it's done, I'm sure, but now like what's the next challenge for you?
I mean, I think as human beings, it's just human nature to be on the X, even if it's a little X. Like, how do I finish this project? Like, so yes, I'm always using my own, um, taking my own advice to get unstuck every day. What's next? I don't know. I know that my calling is to help other people get unstuck. This is literally my life's calling. So, what's next in terms of how I help people do that? I'm not sure. Trying to figure that out. To be continued.
So if people are stuck and they want some help, how do they get a hold of you? What's the best way to reach out to you? Again, I would highly recommend you take a read of the books. I think that'll help you a lot. But if they want to go beyond the book and get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I have a really robust website, which is my three-part name, Michele Rigby Assad. If you can't remember that, just look up, yeah, Breaking Cover or Get Off the X on Amazon. But I do a lot of corporate speaking gigs. I do a lot of that. So I get to reach, thousands of people each year with this message, which is great. So if you want to learn more about me or the books or how I can maybe help you out, there's a forum for contacting me on the website. I'm also on social media. LinkedIn I'm pretty prominent on there, as well as Instagram, Facebook.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. We
Mhm.
very much appreciate you taking the time. Again, I've already said it a bunch of times, but you can find her books on Amazon. I would highly recommend you take a read of them. They're both terrific books. And Michelle, like I said, thank you very much for joining us. We really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope people learned a few things listening to your perspectives.
Thanks so much, Scott. This has been really fun, and I appreciate you reading the books and being so encouraging about, helping us get this message out there. So thank you.
Absolutely. Happy to do it. Great. Well, that wraps another episode of CSI Chat, and I really wanted to thank everybody for listening. If you want to keep up to date on CSI Chat, I would encourage everyone to join our CSI Chat LinkedIn group and or follow us on Twitter/X under CSI Chat. With that, I will get you out of here on a high note with some music, and thanks again.
Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our host an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. CSI Chat, where the numbers meet the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. Tune in every week for a mix of win facts with a clever accountant who's got your back. We'll laugh and we'll learn. Chat, where the topics set us free. CSI Chat is the podcast you'll adore. With our accountant host, you'll always want more. So grab your headphones and join the fun on CSI Chat, where the mystery's never done. We'll see the case.